I came to that because I was working in the video game industry, and I was looking at virtual reality as a technology in 2016, which is like, I guess 10 years ago now.
Wow.
But I put on this big virtual reality headset and I started to play this ping pong game, and the game was so realistic in terms of its physics engine and its responsiveness. It wasn't even that realistic when it came to the graphics, but it felt really like I was really hitting a real ball with a real paddle. So much so that my body forgot that I was just playing a virtual game. And I tried to put the paddle down on the table, and I tried to lean against the table. Of course, there was no table. It was just me in this room with this big, toaster on my head, this VR headset with wires coming from the ceiling. And that's when I began to think about how long would it take us to build an interactive video game or virtual reality that was indistinguishable from physical reality, with AI characters that were indistinguishable from real people. And that got me down this rabbit hole.
Thanks for watching the Near Death Network here on YouTube. My name is Mark Lewis. I thank you for watching our videos, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And as always, leave us your comments. All right, everyone, we are starting another podcast here on the Near Death Network. What's death got to do with it? If you're joining us for the first time, typically what we do is we cover all things near-death experience related with experiencers, clinicians, and academics to really get into the comprehensive look at, is this really a finite death, or is it an extension of consciousness, which we feel it looks like a lot of the data is supporting that consciousness just is. It can never be extinguished. And speaking of academics, it's my pleasure to bring in the new Dr. Rizwan Virk. Congratulations on defending your thesis and getting your title.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's great to be here.
And for those people who are not familiar with your background, it's very intriguing to me because you've dabbled in a little bit of everything. I mean, you've been at MIT, you've been at Stanford, you got into the video game business, you're an entrepreneur, you started your own company, you worked in the film industry. I don't know what you haven't done, but I'm sure we'll cover that too at some point. But thanks so much for stopping by today. I want to talk specifically about the simulation hypothesis, because a lot of our Gen Z and Gen X kids, I call them kids, being on the cusp of 70 myself, they really can relate to the lexicon that you use in the simulation hypothesis to really analogize the NDE to the simulation hypothesis. Take us back to the beginning, and how did you even get interested in the phenomenon of NDEs?
Well, so, for many years, I was an entrepreneur. That was kind of my full-time job. But I was living a bit of a double life. I would, during the day, I would be working with, entrepreneurs, co-founders, employees, venture capitalists, customers, all of those types of things, engineering, finance. And then in the evenings and the weekends, I would explore different aspects of consciousness. Whether it's meditation or through lucid dreaming or shamanic dream work. And so I became interested in a host of, consciousness related phenomena many, many years earlier. And actually, one of the first people whose book I read about NDEs was a guy named Dannion Brinkly, who some of your listeners may know, wrote a book called Saved by the Light. He was struck by lightning back in 1975, and he had one of the more complete, near-death experiences. So that was what got me into, just learning more about it. And then it was years later when I started to go down the rabbit hole of the simulation hypothesis, which is the idea that the physical world is not really physical. It's actually a virtual reality, like a massively multiplayer online game, not unlike that which is depicted in the film The Matrix. If you've seen that, many of your viewers may have seen that, where Neo thinks he's living in a real physical world. He goes to Keanu Reeves, plays Neo. He goes to his office. He has a cubicle. He works for a company called MetaCortex as a programmer. And then he realizes all of that is fake. And so I came to that because I was working in the video game industry, and I was looking at virtual reality as a technology in 2016, which is like, I guess, 10 years ago now.
Wow.
But I put on this big virtual reality headset and I started to play this ping pong game, and the game was so realistic in terms of its physics engine and its responsiveness. It wasn't even that realistic when it came to the graphics, but it felt really like I was really hitting a real ball with a real paddle. So much so that my body forgot that I was just playing a virtual game. And I tried to put the paddle down on the table and I tried to lean against the table. Of course, there was no table. It was just me in this room with this big, toaster on my head, this VR headset with wires coming from the ceilings, coming from the ceiling. And that's when I began to think about how long would it take us to build an interactive video game or virtual reality that was indistinguishable from physical reality with AI characters that were indistinguishable from real people. And that got me down this rabbit hole. And as I started to pursue that, I wrote a book called The Simulation Hypothesis. The first edition came out on the 20th anniversary of the release of The Matrix. So it came out on March 31st, 2019, which was 20 years after 1999 when The Matrix came out. And I had met Dannion at that point, and we had gotten to be friends. And as I thought about, what it would be like for someone who were to take off their virtual reality headset, or if you remember in the film The Matrix, they had what we call a brain-computer interface, where they're plugged into the back of your head. And then suddenly you're in this world. And, of course, when he goes back in, Neo says, "You mean this isn't real?" And he says, "No, it's an actual computer program that's being sent into your brain." And so I began to wonder, well, what is it like if you take it off? And the more exploration I did, so not just of the tech and the AI tech, but also of quantum physics, I realized they were saying there's no such thing as the physical world. Like, physical matter doesn't really exist. It's all information and probabilities. And then I started to look at the religious scriptures, including the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and I realized they were all saying something very similar. But that's when I began to think about near-death experiences in the context of the simulation hypothesis, because for me, one of the most interesting aspects of an NDE is the life review. And I was, again, first introduced to it through Dannion, who called it a holographic panoramic life review, where you relive every memory as if you were there, but you're living it from the point of view of the other person. And so I began to wonder about that. And as a scientist, as an engineer by background, I said, well, how would that work? Well, everything would have to be recorded, and then it would have to be replayed for you while you were inside of it. And basically, it turns out that would be easy to do in a virtual reality. Like, we could think of a mechanism. It would not be so easy to do if you were in a physical reality. So then I began to really link that idea of the life review with the simulation hypothesis together to say, okay, we're playing the game, and then at the end of the game, we can review what happened to us. In fact, there was in 2016, there was another VR game that I had tried on, and it was taking what was normally a two-dimensional game on your laptop, like World of Warcraft, or I think Fortnite had been released by then, or maybe it was just being released. But there was a game called Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and it was a first-person shooter. And one of the things that really struck me about the life review, particularly with Dannion's, was he was in the military, and he literally shot people.
Yeah,
so
he
had
was
to
an
see.
assassin for the CIA, wasn't he? Or
He was an
DOD
assassin for some, DOD,
Yeah.
or say in Vietnam. He was in Vietnam,
Yeah.
but he had to see what it was like for the other person, for the bullet to come towards them, and then there was the ripple effect. Once he killed that person, who he was feeling, what that person was feeling, what happened to their family after that person died, and that's today it's called the ripple effect. But I put on this headset and I replayed a first-person shooter game, but you could set the camera anywhere, so you could set it to the person who you shot, and so you could literally see this character being shot by your character, but you would be in the point of view of that other person. And so that what really got me thinking, okay, if it's a virtual reality and we're outside the reality after we die, or when we have an NDE for a little while, then that would actually make a lot more sense. that's what really got me to make that connection and get even more interested in NDE stories.
So one of the first things I thought of when I read the book and read the trailers and talked to you and listened to your interviews was, not being a techie myself, my first question is, so who's the boss then? Who's the boss of the game? Are we the initiators? Is there a god? Is there, is it like the Wizard of Oz? Somebody's behind the curtain and pulling the levers. And how do you use that metaphor then to extrapolate the simulation hypothesis?
Well, so I'm glad you used the term metaphor, because I think that's a good way to think about it. Since the beginning of time, mystics have been peeking outside of this reality. And then they've been coming back and they've been trying to explain what they saw or what they learned. And oftentimes that gets turned into a scripture or a religion. But they have to explain it to the people that are there in the physical world, kind of like Plato's cave. When the philosopher escapes the cave, he has to come back in, and then he has to explain what the sun is like. Of course, nobody there has seen the sun because they've been chained inside the cave their whole life. And he says, well, it's like a fire, but it's much bigger, right? So they use a metaphor of something they already know. And what I found was that the religious scriptures are full of technological metaphors. They use, things like books, chariots, gates, wheels, like all these things. Even clothing is a technology, if you think about it, to try to explain this process of coming into the world and of leaving the world. And so I think the latest and best metaphor is actually that the world is like a video game. And so in a video game, you have a player who exists outside of the game, and you have a character inside the game. And now what's interesting is that the term we use for that character inside the game is actually the term avatar. That's your avatar inside the game. And when the guys at Lucasfilm, which is George Lucas's company he set up after the success of Star Wars, they were making video games, early video games. I mean, we're talking back in the days of the Commodore 64, where you had dial-up lines with those modems that made those sounds. And so they created an online graphical world. It was only 2D, so it wasn't particularly impressive visually, and you could only have like 5 people in a room or something. But still, they were looking for a word to call the character that you were controlling, and they ended up going back to the ancient Sanskrit term avatar or avatara, which means when there is a divine entity that squeezes itself down into a human body. So it's an incarnation of the divine. And they said they felt like they were taking their full physical body and their mind and squeezing it into the telephone lines, going through the modems onto the screen. And so they used that term. And I think that's an appropriate term. So if we think of the soul as the player and we think of the body as the avatar, well, then you get a version of the game that makes sense. Now, there was a guy named Swami Yogananda who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi.
SRF, yeah.
Yeah, SRF. So Yogananda came over in 1920 from India. He was one of the first Swamis to come and really live in the U.S. and teach in the U.S. And when he came over, he had to explain these ancient Indian ideas to the populace, which is primarily Christian, but also America is a very technologically savvy, but also technophilic, like we love technology country.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was trying to describe the idea of Maya. And so if you think of Maya, it usually translates to illusion, but it's a little more subtle than that. It translates to a carefully crafted illusion, like almost one that you agree to jump into. Like if you go to a magic show, you know that guy's not really sawing the woman in half. But it's you suspend your disbelief in a sense. And so he said, how can I explain this to the modern world? And so he used a modern technology. At the time, the 1920s, and even before that, movies were relatively new. And so he said that basically the world is like a film that's projected, from a film projector, and that the characters are suffering in the film, but the actors aren't really dying. The actors go on before and after the movie. And he would always tell his students, he would say it in his Bengali accent. There's like a video of this online somewhere. He goes, "Look away from the screen, look at the light," because the light is what's important. but we're so caught up in the drama. Now, I
Right.
actually wrote a book about him called Wisdom of a Yogi, and it was HarperCollins India asked me to write this book on the 75th anniversary of autobiography of a yogi. And I was like, "You sure you want me to write it?" They wanted to write it for Indians, and I'm like, "Well, first of all, technically, I'm not an Indian. I'm from Pakistan. Second, I'm not really a Hindu, but I do quote Yogananda a lot." And they said, "No, because we want you to use modern technology to try to explain some of these ancient spiritual ideas." And so I said, "Well, if Yogananda were alive today, I believe he would say it's like a film. We're the actors and the characters, but we're also the audience. So we're sitting around watching ourselves, and we have a script, but we can change the script. So we have like this free will, and we're all kind of in it together." And what does that sound like? It sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. So that's the way that I think of the metaphor of life as a video game, and it's a pretty powerful one today because especially for young people who spend all their
Right.
time, like my nephews, they
Yeah.
come home
My
from
son-in-law.
school.
Yeah.
Your son-in-law, they come home from school, and then we used to go out and play ball with our friends, at least the ones who lived
Right.
close to us. We didn't really get to see the ones who lived further away, but they'll come home from school and then they'll get online with all their friends from school wherever they live. And so that's a natural thing for them to have an avatar, but there's still a part of us that's the player outside of it, that would then analogize to the soul, or the Atman in the Hindu traditions, or the Ruh in the
Right.
Islamic traditions, or the soul as we think of it in the West.
Well, and a couple of interesting things. There's a lot to unpack there. But first, as it relates to Yogananda, a lot of people probably don't know this if they're not familiar with his story and the evolution of SRF and how it became prominent here in a lot of circles. And I worshiped at the local temple here in Phoenix. It's on Central Avenue. And, Babaji and Lahiri Mahasaya and a lot of the characters that are prominent in his story are very interesting in terms of bilocation and a lot of things that disrupt what we consider to be physical impossibilities. But he said when he transitioned, he would lay uncorrupted, and he did for 20 days, and they documented it. So he actually gave people proof. Now, in this day and age, if somebody did something that remarkable, if you or I said, "Okay, I'm going to transition, and when I do, my body will lay uncorrupted for 20 days. That would confound everyone, right? It would be front page news everywhere, but a lot of people don't even know that.
That's true. And his autobiography was full of these types of miracles of saints who are bilocating, saints that are levitating, saints that are teleporting from one location to another, sending telepathic messages. And if you look at Yogananda's own description, he tried to describe that for people of the West to say, well, how is this done? And his basic point was that the world is made of light, and so certain masters are able to materialize or condense the light into matter, project themselves into different places. And what does that sound like today? Again, today we would say it's like a hologram or like a video game,
Right.
because when you look at a screen, you're basically just looking at electromagnetic radiation, which is what light is. But then there's information that's telling that electromagnetic radiation what to render where. And that's what gets back to the quantum physics side of it, is that the simulation hypothesis itself has a series of propositions. I think this will be interesting to your audience too. So the first is that the world is not physical, but that it consists of information. Turns out most physicists won't debate that anymore. They'll kind of say, yeah, generally that's true. The second is that the information gets computed like a quantum computer through some mathematical or algorithmic process. Okay, some physicists might agree, some may not agree to that. So it's a little more controversial, but I think most people can get on board with that. The third is that it gets rendered for us. That information gets rendered to look like a physical object, like this water bottle. And there was a guy named John Wheeler who was a physicist at Princeton. He worked with Einstein and with Niels Bohr and others. And he came up with a phrase towards the end of his life. He said, I kept looking for what matter is. I thought it was a particle, like a physical. When we say particle, we think of like a physical object. Turns out there's no such thing.
Right.
Yeah, right. It's mostly 99% empty space. He said at the end of his life, he began to think that it's just answers to a series of yes/no questions, which are like zeros and ones of properties. And he said it from bit. So anything that's an it actually consists of bits of information. So the third assertion is that this world gets rendered for us. And that is actually part of the actual meaning of the ancient term Maya. It's actually the power by which we are fooled into thinking this is real. And then the fourth assertion, which my scientist friends, won't necessarily agree with, but I think most spiritual people agree, is that it's all a big hoax, right? And then finally, the fifth assertion is that we have agreed to participate in this hoax.
Right. So we have agency, even though it doesn't seem like we exercise agency. Sometimes it seems like random things are thrown at us in life. But I know you alluded to it many times that it's something that's very commonplace, I found among experiencers, is that we sit with our guides, however you want to characterize them, angels, the tribunal, before we incarnate, we come down here. And we go over the parameters of our life's outline. But like you've articulated, I believe 100% that we have sovereignty. So in that outline, we could go left instead of go right. And then there's a different probability that exists for going left than going right. And so that's where a lot of uniformity, I think, in your postulates really dovetail nicely with what the NDD experience is.
Yeah. And sometimes you'll even see, within the NDE's experiences, you'll see not just a life review, but also what's called a life preview, which is seeing what might happen if they went down this path, and then what might happen if they go down this path. And if we step back and think of ourselves as watching a computer or screen, and many NDErs have their own descriptions of what the life review looks like. Some talk about being in a theater, some talk about having hundreds or thousands of screens around them, but the most common is you get sucked right in and you're there. But you'll notice they'll use these technology ideas of screens. And but in a video game, the way it works is at the beginning you choose your character, and when you choose your character, you might choose like an elf, a dwarf, a human, a gnome, some other type of fairy, whatever, a dragon, and then you choose the profession. Is your character going to be a wizard? Is it going to be a thief? Is it going to be a warrior, a barbarian? Is it going to be a cleric? There are all these different professions, and then you choose a backstory. And I feel like that, which is how Dungeons and Dragons works. When I was a kid, or a teenager, we used to sit around a table, and today that game has become popular again because of Stranger Things, in particular. It's got a revival. But if we think of ourselves that way, and then you go on a campaign and you have other players, and you say, okay, with these players, I'm going to do this campaign, and the campaign has a storyline that touches on your overall storyline, and you can take that character sheet into other adventures. And if we think of it that way, I think it really helps to solidify this connection between the game idea, the virtual reality idea, and the NDE idea. And even if you look at folks who've been hypnotized or who remember pre-birth, people who remember looking down and kind of choosing a life. There was a guy named Dr. Michael Newton, whose work you may be familiar with. He wrote Journey of Souls.
Before Life.
Yeah, that was the second book, I think. And then, and then it turns out, Dolores Cannon wrote a similar book based upon her hypnosis interviews about the in-between, what the Tibetans call the bardo. And they describe very similar things. She even describes a computer that has different possibilities that can show you, or like she calls them yarns or timelines. But with Michael Newton, it's like a computer that has these points. So if you think of your life as having maybe certain points that are fixed, but between that, you can make all kinds of choices, and you could like tweak, you could turn the knob, and you could see what would happen, almost like a TV set. Turns out there was another group of hypnotherapists who wrote a book even before those in the 80s called Life Between Life. It was a guy named Joel Witten, I think, back in Toronto. Anyway, they described very similar types of things. And so I think even that fits well within the simulation model. Now, there was a woman named Natalie Sudman. I don't know if you've ever encountered her near-death experience, but she was in Iraq, and they were hit by an IED. And so she said she was on the other side. She had the life review. And then after that, some other standard NDE types of things happened. But she said at one point they were trying to decide what was going to happen to her when she went back. And so she had a life preview or a multiple life preview. Now this happens oftentimes with women who are mothers, right? Because they'll say, here's what's going to happen if you don't go back. Because of course nobody wants to come back probably more what I hear, and you're probably more familiar.
No, you're absolutely correct.
Than I am. But they want to stay on the other side, but they'll show them, well, this is what's going to happen to your kids if you don't go back, and this is what's going to happen to your kids if you do go back. And of course, they'll decide to come back then because they don't want their kids to be raised by somebody else. So when I say life previews, though, that's kind of what I mean. It's the preview at life selection, but then it's the preview. Maybe we're constantly doing this life preview in what I call the writer's room of our lives, where we're sitting back, where we have the part of us in the game, we have the part of us outside the game. And for her, it was like, well, what will happen if you can never walk again? What'll happen if you can never see again? What'll happen if you get healed? Like there were all these options. Now it sounds gruesome to us, right? She's describing,
right?
And she goes, but it was fun at the time. Obviously, it wasn't fun when she came back, but it was fun to try to explore these different options to say, hey, what would happen if just that happens to me? What would happen?
Well, she saw the line. She saw the line of demarcation as it being a role, as it being the end all be all. The physical infirmities. She saw it. Yeah, I'd like to play that role. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's very complex. It's dynamic. It's almost you get more brownie points for playing a complex role than you do one that's mundane. And also, I really think to the life review, and Jeff Jansen's written several great books about it, and the ripple effect, but it's oftentimes the most benign acts that are the ones that are acknowledged as the most pure of thought and heart. Something where I opened a door for you and you were in a wheelchair and nobody had ever looked at you and they didn't make eye contact. And I was just, imparting love and respect for you as another human being. And in the constellation of our lives, we would never probably pick that out of a life review. But when you get it, the impact and the feeling that was transferred to that individual by your love and you're caring for them. He has another great story where he talks about a guy throwing a gum wrapper in a tributary off of out of his car into a river. And this guy sees it in his life review and it winds up clogging the river up and he feels horrible. He participated environmentally in something that was, it was a contraindication of what he was even thinking about. He wasn't thinking, but something that minute aggregated. If you and we all did that, then the river plugs up, right? So
yes,
oftentimes it's not the big things.
Yeah, that's very true. And people always ask me, well, if it's a game, what's the purpose of the game? And I say, well,
that's a great question.
Let's ask a couple questions. Why do we play video games? And part of the reason is, to have fun. But you have fun by having experiences that you can't have outside of the video game. Like I can't jump on a dragon and shoot arrows at orcs. Maybe some people could, but since they're, we don't know of any dragons, it's not likely to happen in the so-called physical world, but I can do it inside a virtual reality. And so, we may be doing similar things. And to your point about, playing a role, I think that's a really important one because people often say, well, why is there so much suffering in the world? There can't be a God because there's so much suffering in the world. And I say, well, what if the people who are suffering are the more advanced players who have come to take on that role? Just like, the actors who win the Academy Award typically, not always, but usually will win it for playing a role that is very difficult and that goes through a lot of suffering and challenges. And that's how video games work. We choose our challenges through what are called quests. And sometimes the quests are individual quests. Like, okay, you're going to go to the Goblin King and fight the Goblin King to get the gold. Or sometimes they're group quests, what are called raids. You go together and you're trying to do something with certain other players. In fact, what happens with a lot of these games is they used to do raids at certain times. Meet Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the Goblin King's castle because we're all going to do this together. And, are we...
Yes, a castle.
And are we doing that with our friends, our quote unquote friends? Because in a video game, we have friends list, but with other souls saying, okay, at this part of my life, I'm going to be in this city and perhaps we can meet there and we'll recognize each other. And then we have the little clues for the synchronicities that come up. So that's very interesting.
I think that is interesting because you had mentioned that in one of the lectures I had listened to, that synchronicity rather, or resonance or sense of attraction to another individual or a group of individuals is born out of familiarity that we can't really identify. And you talk about a paper, I don't know if it was ancient Greece, but you mentioned it was Greece, but it's the veil being shut. So forgetfulness, we come down here, our slate's wiped clean, because if we found out that we were going to be crippled, live on the, very destitute conditions, never eat, have several maladies, then we might question and go, I don't know, can I take a pass? Can I go back? Can I be a home run hitting star in Major League Baseball, or something that's more reasonable in terms of having fun? But I think therein lies the challenge of, like you analogize it very well with the video game, is the more difficult, like you say, if I'm a 2 and I don't play video games, but so forgive me if I'm using the lexicon.
Level 2, let's say level 2, right?
So you say you're a level 2, but then you're playing somebody who's a level 30, or they're in the game. Your expectation can't be that great, but you want to ascend, right? You want to be better by actually playing with someone who has honed their skills that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so on that first point about forgetfulness, this is something that appears in all the scriptures in some form or another, or most scriptures. And in the Greek traditions, they have Lethe, which is the river of forgetfulness. And you cross Lethe. It's interesting, water often comes up as part of this idea of forgetfulness. That's one of the metaphors that's very common. Another is in the Chinese traditions, you have Meng Po, and she is the goddess of forgetfulness. And she brews the tea of forgetfulness, which you drink at the beginning and at the end of an incarnation to forget stuff. And in the Islamic traditions, they have the veil of forgetfulness. They have, the 70,000 veils, especially the Sufi mystics talk about the 70,000 veils between you and God. And what are those veils? They're light and dark, but they make you forget. In fact, the term that's used in the Islamic world for a person is called insan in Arabic, which means something like a prisoner. But then a prisoner of what? Turns out you're a prisoner of an Arabic term called nisyan. And what does nisyan mean? It means forgetfulness. So you're actually, a prisoner of forgetfulness because you don't remember that you were with God, or you don't remember your soul. And then I was on a podcast last year with a woman who's from a kind of a well-known actress from The Big Bang Theory, and Mayim Bialik. Yeah, Mayim Bialik, and she's Jewish, and I was telling her about this forgetfulness, and she said, "Oh yeah, we have something like that in the Jewish traditions too." And I said, "What's that?" And she goes, "We have an angel, and what the angel does is before you're born, it teaches you everything, so you kind of know everything, like all the information about how the world works, and then this angel Layla presses right here on your upper lip, and that's why there's a cleft there supposedly, but." When she does that, you forget everything and you're born, and now you have to relearn everything. Now, I often tell people that these, the goddess, in this case, Meng Po of forgetfulness, or the angel, that these are also metaphors. It's not like there's one person, one angel who sits there to every baby. It's a lot of work. Or St. Peter sits there for every single person and decide. It's more like a function that is performed, which sounds more like an algorithm or a code that runs when you come in. And this even ties back to the life review, actually, because I was looking at the Islamic traditions, and they have this idea of the scroll of deeds, which is a book, which is a technology metaphor. A book is a technological metaphor. And in the Jewish and Christian traditions, you have the book of life, where all your good deeds and bad deeds are being written down. Depending on who you talk to in the Christian and Jewish traditions, the book of life may be who gets into heaven, but then how do they decide whether to put your name in there or not? Well, they look at the other books, all the other books of your life. And there's Jewish holidays where you're supposed to review all your deeds from the last year, and you do it every year. So it's like a life review each year. But with Islam, they actually have names of these angels They're called the Kiram and Kitabin, and one of them writes down all your good deeds, and one of them writes down all your bad deeds. And then it literally says in the Quran, after you die, your book is open to you, and you have to read what you have done and the effects, the ripple effects, we would call it today, on other people. And so that I try to tell people is that's a metaphor. That doesn't mean there's a physical book and then St. Peter is opening up this physical book or that these angels are writing with feather pens. Rather, it sounds like a recording of a process, just like we do with our games. And then on YouTube, the most popular content is actually video game sessions. Yeah. They record the session and then they watch the session. And it's similar to what we're talking about here. So the book of life is the life review. It's just a different metaphor for that. And both of them, and the angels are actually just recording. They're actually called recording angels. Even there's a statue in Washington, D.C. of a recording angel with a book that's recording things down. And then later I found out that there's actually something in the Hindu tradition as well. There's a guy named Chitragupta, who's kind of a minor figure within the mythology, but he sits next to a very major figure, who is Yama, the god of death. And Chitragupta is called the accountant. So another kind of metaphor that's used. And he writes down everything in a book called the Agra Sandhani, which we think of as being part of the Akashic records, which includes like everything. But this is like kind of the record of what you did. And then that's used to determine your next life, whether you're in a hellish world or a heavenly world. And so even within the reincarnation framework, you have something very similar going on. But again, that's a metaphor for something today we would call a database. Right? It's a database of information.
Right.
And so while you're living your life, you're kind of putting stuff into this database. And then later, you can decide what to do with that if you're going to play the game again, if you're going to come back in, depending on if you believe in that or not.
Well, and that's what Edgar Cayce did. A sleeping prophet, he would go into trance-like states, and then he would read the Akashic records and say, okay, Riz, you're not coming back for a while, but when you do, it's going to be a hell of a ride, because here's what you say. You're going to be leading the insurgency of Norse people against the Europeans who are invading the continent, and you're going to be 6'4", and you're going to weigh 250 pounds, which is difficult to ride a horse at that size. You could extrapolate all types of different things, but I really want to make, because what you're talking about metaphorically is so tied directly to the near-death experience. In all my readings and in looking at different stories, the archetype of deity in the individual society that the individual has the near-death experience is typically what produces. In Christianity, it's Jesus. If you're a Buddhist, it's Buddha. Or sometimes you have Buddha and Jesus. But if you're a Tassidae Aborigine in New Zealand, whatever the deity on the cave wall was that you thought was a supreme deity will be shown to shepherd you across. And that makes sense, because that's very comforting to you. They have a good place in your mindset. But then when you get up to the position where you can actually, okay, now I'm deprogrammed from that game, that rendering, whatever it is, then you get an opportunity to sit with people again and say, okay, what am I going to do this time? John Davis, who had a near-death experience, said the way he expressed it was really good. He said, why the hell would we want to come down here? People say, they look at all the strife and the terrible wars and everything that's going on. The right hates the left hates the right. He said, this is really a unique environment, because I can tell you how to ride a bike, but until you balance and fall and scrape your knee and accommodate for whatever physical characteristics you need to do to master that bike, you can't do that over there. He said, you can't mimic that. So that's why from his perspective, and it made sense, that's why this area, Earth, is so coveted, because you can have those experiences. I mean, they're literally visceral and physical, even though you've articulated, and all of science says there is no matter. Everything's in motion constantly. So it's illusory. It is Maya. And that's why I was fascinated by the way that you tied the illusory aspect to the gaming aspect to the near-death experience. Because when somebody like me, who's very simple, needs to make, okay, what's the rationale then? Why do we come down here? Why do we subject ourselves to suffering? But you're looking at it from the human angle as opposed to the angle of deity. And we're all that individual spark of divinity, right? We have all the components necessary to do what we need to do. But when we get the river of forgetfulness and we cross it, we come down here and somehow it only comes in snippets then.
Yep, absolutely.
You know, I mean,
and people can only describe that metaphorically because they don't quite know what is this process of incarnation. You know, how does it work? And I like to say, well, let's use the video game metaphor to say it's when you put on the headset, you plug in, like in the Matrix, or some other, you know, mechanism that's used to leak. But when you go through forgetfulness, that's the point at which you really are incarnating, yes, within that physical body. And turns out, you know, that metaphor that is also used, that is also described using metaphors. So in the Bhagavad Gita, they say the soul puts on the body just like you would put on a set of clothes. And then, of course, in the Bhagavad Gita, it talks about you take them off too. But it turns out Rumi, you know, the Sufi mystic poet, he says something almost exactly similar. He basically says that the soul, which is called the ruh in the Islamic traditions, puts on the body like a set of clothes, right? So they're using these exact same technology metaphors, but they're using, you know, terms that would have been very easy for people to understand, you know, thousands of years ago. And so today, I think we can even add a little more subtlety to it. And that's why I like to use, you know, the video game idea or the virtual reality idea.
So this is called the simulation hypothesis, but there's also the simulated multiverse. And when you get into the multiverse, then, well, you lose me at I'm not techie, like I already told you, but when you get into multiple dimensional levels of energy and resonance and simultaneous existence, like, you know, the Seth Speaks books and talking about reality, what is reality and the defining reality, then it gets a little murky. How do you define the genesis of this? Or is there a way to even determine what the genesis of all these experiences that we've talked about in the last 45 minutes?
Well, you know, that's not an easy question to answer. For me, though, I think of it just in terms of from the simulation hypothesis, why I went to the simulated multiverse is this thought sort of struck in my head. Well, if you can run one simulation or one video game, why can't you run more than one? And it was because I was speaking to the wife of Philip K. Dick, you know, the science fiction writer who wrote books that the Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall, all of these movies were based on. But there was one called The Man in the High Castle, which was about an alternate timeline where basically Germany and Japan won World War II, and then they broke up America between them. And so you had kind of a police state. And later, Philip K. Dick came to believe that was a real timeline that actually happened, but it was unwound. And to me, like that makes sense in a simulation or a simulated environment. So if we think of a multiverse, there are lots of different, you know, every time you make a decision, it's going off in two branches, let's say. Each of those is almost a new universe. Now that gets to a lot of universes, but if you think of it as a computer simulation or some type of a video game, or you can actually say, well, then it's pretty easy. You can just run this other process, see how far you want to take it and stop it, and then you can come back to this process. And so in fact, when I talk about these life previews that people see in their near-death experiences, I see it almost like running forward the simulation while they're outside of it. And each of those is like a timeline that they're watching. But then, just like when an AI plays chess, it sort of projects the board forward. If I do this, what will you do? And if you do this, what will I do? And then it does that multiple times. Basically, it's creating multiple simulated timelines. And then we come back to this timeline. And sometimes those timelines don't work out. So Philip K. Dick's theory was that timeline where Germany and Japan won World War II was not continued by the simulators because it didn't lead to a better outcome, whatever better means from the point of view of being outside. So we may be doing this ourselves like sometimes, misfortune befalls people. Like even NDE seems like a big misfortune, but then later people say it was the most important thing in my life, because it taught me how to live my life moving forward. So it kind of changed their timeline. If you think of Dannion Brinkly, he was in the military, he was an assassin, he was a bully, and he's become like this nicest guy in the world.
And now he's
You know,
hospice devoted. He's taking veterans across the veil. I mean, he's devoted his life to the antithetical position that he had taken.
exactly. And,
Yeah.
and what if some part of him, along with his guides, again, what I call his writer's room, said, well, if you don't have the NDE, this is where you're going to go. So we think it's better for you to have this unfortunate incident. I mean, it's being struck by lightning. We always talk about the positive aspects of NDEs, but the negative aspects are pretty horrific.
Well, he was in the crypt. He was still alive. They had already put him in the crypt.
Yeah.
And if you read obviously the book is
Yeah.
amazing, but he
Yeah.
finally taps on the roof and said, "Hey, I'm still here."
I'm still here, right? And it took months of just laying on the couch. And, I had something similar in my life where I had to have heart surgery. And I had a series of visions while I was recovering from that kind of convinced me that part of the reason for that was I was still on this, I had a plan in this life. And the life plan was to be an entrepreneur, and then in the software industry, and then to be a writer. But I wasn't getting on with being a writer. I was still spending most of my time, in the world of business and startups and venture capital and money. And after this, I couldn't do that anymore. I mean, I physically couldn't do that. The only amount of energy I had was to go to Starbucks to do writing for a couple hours a day. And then it was back on the couch for me for the rest of the day. And that's when I ended up writing 2 books in 9 months that got published, including the simulation hypothesis, over this long recovery. And every time I tried to jump back in the business world, like every time I'd feel better, I'm like, okay, I'm ready. Let's do another game company or something. I would end up back in the hospital. And so it was like this way of looking at these different timelines ourselves and perhaps picking from them. Like if that hadn't happened, I probably wouldn't have finished the simulation hypothesis. I probably would not be here talking to you and talking about religion and NDEs. I'd probably still be in Silicon Valley, and who knows if I would still even be around in terms of my health as well. So I think sometimes there's if we think of simulated multiverse that way, where these are experiences we might want to preview, and then that might work at a whole society level too. There may be multiple timelines societally, and that may explain something called the Mandela effect. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole.
Well, yeah, that's a big can of worms to open. We'll have to do that on another show. But it is very interesting because people will swear that they had that experience and they didn't. And, they had thought that Nelson Mandela had died and he hadn't died. And they were convinced that he had died. And just like Tiananmen Square, when, the soldier who was in front of the tank, many people swear he got run over, but he didn't. He was fine.
Yeah.
And so our minds are very active and they're driven. I think what the beauty of this whole thing, to wrap it up and sum it up, is that we still are in charge, even though a lot of times it doesn't seem like we are. You were given the opportunity to experience heart issues because you needed to be put back on your track, right? So a lot of people would say, how about just the flu?
Right. I don't recommend going through heart surgery. Get the message sooner. Don't be thick-headed like I was.
Yeah, well, but it was always for me too. I was a linear guy, a sportscaster, but I've always been a metaphysician. I loved the Eastern religions as a kid because the Atman to me resonated more than a lot of the tenets of Christianity, traditional Christianity. But I was a little reluctant because I thought, well, this is my role. They're going to think I'm totally psycho, which they probably do anyway. But I don't care anymore. You have to follow your bliss, like Joseph Campbell said. Find your bliss. And like you said, try to do it in a more gentle way than having to have heart surgery.
Yeah, absolutely.
So where can people get a hold of your books? And I know you do a lot of traveling. You speak all over the country. Do you have a web presence where they can just check and what would that be?
Yeah, so my website is called zenentrepreneur.com, and the title is based from my first book, which was called Zen Entrepreneurship, which was about living this double life. They can also follow me on on Instagram at Riz Cambridge, like the city or the university, or on X Twitter at Riz Stanford, which is like the university.
Very good. Well, we really appreciate you stopping by, and I do as well. And I know we need to get together and have a lunch, you and Lynn and I again, and because we didn't even broach UAPs or UFOs or what that is. And I think you have a fascinating hypothesis about what that is that really does resonate with me as well. So let's just say that'll be our next appointment here on What's Death Got to Do with It.
Sounds great. Great to be here with you today.